Okay.
Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Nice to see you
Morning.
all.
Good morning.
Always great to get together and learn some Torah together. And I think we're all pretty much vaccinated now. We're feeling a little bit more comfortable, a bit more secure, and hopefully looking forward to hearing Parsha Zohar and hearing the Megillah, hopefully in a shul or at least with a minyan, provided we're not snowed under. So there's still a few question marks in the air, but please God, all will work out well. What I'd like to try and do is just have a look at some of the themes which are brought up by Parsha Zohar and Megillas Esther as they relate to Sefer Bereshis. When I started this course, I chose the title Themes from Sefer Bereshis because in a certain way, Sefer Bereshis, the events, the personalities, and the issues which are recorded in Sefer Bereshis are a type of a template, a type of a preview of Jewish history. The Jewish history is in some way, everything that happens in Jewish history has its makor. In some way, it has a sheirish in Sefer Bereshis. This is sometimes clear, sometimes less clear, but there's no question the phrase used by the Ramban, famously known, I think, to many of us, is Maisa Ovos Simon Labonim. What does that mean? Maisa Ovos Simon Labonim. It means that what the Ovos did, it's a simon. It contains within it, if you like, it's got the, to use a modern metaphor, if you like, within Sefer Bereshis is the DNA of Jewish history. Everything that will eventually come out in Jewish history is somehow imprinted in Sefer Bereshis in so many different ways. And I'd like to show you a few of them as they relate. So last week, I showed you, just to remind you, we looked last week at the one word in Parsha Zohar, Asher Koracha Baderech. If you remember, we looked at that word, which is one of the mysterious words. All the other words in Parsha Zohar are pretty straightforward. What does it mean? That Haman attacked you. But what does Koracha mean? We don't find anywhere else in the Torah, really, that the word kuf reish, which means kar, is used as a verb. Right? Kar is usually an adjective. Something is cold, then it's adjective. Asher koracha baderech. What could that possibly mean? What is that a verb? So Rashi brings down three perushim, and indeed one of Rashi's perushim, which I didn't look at last week, is that it means cold, and koracha means they cooled you down. They cooled you down. In what sense were Klal Yisrael cooled down by Amalek? So there are lots of different perushim to this. But the following the derech of Rashi is that Klal Yisrael coming out of the 10 Makkos and Kriyas Yamsuf, we're at the end of Beshalach, right? Amalek attack at the end of Beshalach. All the nations were really scared. All the nations were in many ways intimidated by Klal Yisrael, and they felt that there's no way that the Klal Yisrael were untouchable. They were the holy nation, with clearly God's protection, and there was nothing to be done about it. Amalek, by attacking, they showed that they weren't afraid, showed that they, in a sense, they cooled down the fear of the other nations. That's how Rashi sees it. I must tell you, there's some very nice perushim, other perushim, or what it means here is that Amalek has the power, in a sense, to cool down the passion of Klal Yisrael. But Klal Yisrael have a passion for Avodat Hashem, a passion for the mitzvahs, a passion for our emunah, and one of the goals of Amalek is to cool us down and to tell us, well, it's not so certain. There are doubts about this. It's not so clear. to blur the lines and to blur our emunah and to blur our simcha. And in that sense, the removal of Amalek, which was the destruction of Haman and his sons, allowed Klal Yisrael to re-engage once again with the Simcha of Purim. And that's one of the origins of the great Simcha of Purim, is that Klal Yisrael had lost their Simcha. They'd lost their joy because here they were living in fear. There's nothing that kills Simcha more than fear. And they lived in fear of genocide, of Haman. And in that sense, in that sense, he cooled us down. That's one of Rashi's Perushim. Last week, we looked at the other Perush of Rashi, which is that Koracha comes from the word mikra. Mikra meaning coincidence. That everything that happens in life is a chance event, that there are no intelligent, there is no hashgacha pratis, there is no divine guiding hand. Everything is just a random. And we discussed that a little bit. The randomness of the universe is really one of the key ideas of Amalek, which is the antithesis of our emunah. Right? Our emunah is that there was the Bria Sa'elam took place because of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's wisdom and desire to bring a world into existence, and there was nothing random about it. Similarly, every event in our life is not random, it is hashgacha pratis. These are some of the ideas which we looked at last week. I'd like to connect them to something else in Sefer Bereshis, which I'd like to show you. And maybe just as an introduction to this piece, which we didn't look at last week, is the word Purim itself is a very odd name for a yontif, right? Why would and it's the Megillah itself tells us, right, that these days, these great days are called Purim, right? At the end of the Megillah, it says Mordechai and Esther legislated that Klal Yisrael should rejoice and celebrate these days, and they're called Purim. Why are they called Purim? Al Shem HaPur. What was the Pur? Pei Vav Reish doesn't even seem to be a Hebrew word at all, as a matter of fact, according to the Mepharshim. We don't know in the Tanakh anywhere else the word Pur, Pei Vav Reish. So what could that possibly mean? So the in chapter 3 of Megillas Esther, it says that when Haman decided to attack the Jewish people, what did he do? Hipil Pur, hu hagorol. So the pasuk says that the Hebrew word goral is equivalent to the word pur, and presumably the word pur is a word in ancient Persian language. And it's strange. Two things are strange. It's strange that we should use a Persian word as a name of a yontif, and it's also strange that this device, this sort of lottery device that Haman used to decide that he wanted to destroy the Jewish people on that day, on the 13th of Adar, that should be the name of the yontif. Why is that the name of the yontif? It's a bit weird. And it needs a bit of perush. I'm going to try and show you a little bit of some material on this subject. So let's have a look for a moment. Share a screen. Okay. That's not going to work. Bear with me for 1 minute, Rabbi Sai. Right, still not good. Okay. So we're getting there. Right. Okay, is there a text? Yes? Good. You can see a text. So let's look at a few psukim from Megillas Esther. Okay, everybody with me? So the pasuk says, right, that Achashverosh promoted Haman to an all-powerful role in the empire, and v'chol avdei hamelech asher b'shar hamelech kairim u'mishtachavem laHaman. Everybody bowed down to Haman, because that was the royal decree, that whenever Haman appears, everyone should bow down to him. So that was the law. And yet, Mordechai lo yichra v'lo yishtachave. And Mordechai would not kneel or bow to him. So Mordechai is rebelling against Haman. And I must tell you, there's an interesting, this itself is an interesting issue in the whole of Megillas Esther, because Mordechai's refusal to bow to Haman really was the trigger for Haman's plan to destroy Klal Yisrael. And in a sense, why did he do this? What was going through Mordechai's mind when he did this? Especially according to Chazal, that Mordechai didn't just, if you like, passively refuse to bow. He actually ran around and chose a prominent place wherever Haman. He looked up in the Times. The Times newspaper every day tells us where the queen is going to be and where the prime minister is going to be. He looked up where Haman is going to be today, and he made sure to stand in the front row. And everybody else bowed down, and he lo kom v'lo zah. He didn't move. So he is very defiantly not bowing down to Haman. He's making a statement designed to anger Haman. And is this, so Chazal, it's generally a question, is this the right thing to do? Was he behaving correctly or not? Was he not endangering Klal Yisrael by doing this? And indeed, it triggered off a plan of genocide. I must just tell you that in the closing posuk of the whole of Megillas Esther, it says about Mordechai that he is rotzui l'roiv echov. Does that posuk ring any bells with anybody? That he's rotzui l'roiv echov. Derish tov la'amav, derish tov, right? The very, very last pasuk of the whole of Megillas Esther. He's rotzui l'roiv echov. What does that mean, rotzui l'roiv echov? That means most of the Jewish people and most of his colleagues were happy with him. It's a bit strange. Why were only here? He has outwitted Haman, destroyed Haman, gotten rid of the genocide. He's now a tremendous position of power. And why is he only rotzui l'roiv echov? Why is he only most of his colleagues happy with him? So in rabbinic life, it's generally speaking, it's mentioned that this is the most any rabbi can ever wish for, is that most of his colleagues are happy with him. No rabbi should ever think that ever all his colleagues are going to be happy with him, because life ain't like that, right? There is no way where any Jewish leader, right, the general principle of keeping everybody happy. You would have thought, why would anybody not be happy with Mordechai? What's he done that they shouldn't be happy with him, right? He's achieved something which no one else could achieve, and he's gotten rid of the monster. He's killed the monster and saved Klal Yisrael. And the answer is, some of the Mefarshim suggest that they were angry. They were still angry with him because it's true he got rid of Haman, but he also provoked Haman. So in a sense, his refusal, his public display of a refusal to bow down, that really triggered off Haman and Haman's plan to destroy Klal Yisrael in the first place. And therefore, it's true that some of his colleagues said, yeah, it's very nice of him that he saved us from this man, but he's responsible for triggering off the hatred in the first place. I must say that in Chazal, there is Chazal do question Mordechai, because we do find at the beginning of Vayishlach, again, everything comes back to Sefer Bereshis. At the beginning of Vayishlach, Yaakov meets Esau, right? And Esau is galloping towards him with the Arba Me'osh Ish Imo, with 400 armed warriors, and he poses a great threat. And what does Yaakov do? Anyone remember, what does Yaakov do when he meets Esau? What does Yaakov do?
He bows 7 times.
He bows down again and again. He bows down. So Chazal ask about Mordechai, your Zayda bowed down to Esau. Haman is a descendant of Esau, right? Remember that Haman is Amalek, and Amalek was a grandson of Esau. Yaakov bowed down to Esau. Why don't you, in other words, in times of danger, the Jewish people have to submit to the Esavs in this world. We have to submit to them. We shouldn't provoke them. So there are a couple of very interesting issues here. One of them is Has anyone ever heard this question and answer at all? One of them is that actually Mordechai is described in the Megillah as Ish Yemini. Anyone know what that means? Ish Yemini?
From Binyamin.
From Binyamin. Yemini means he comes from the tribe of Binyamin. Okay, so which Chazal say it's true that Yaakov bowed down and that all his sons bowed down and his wives bowed down to Esav, but Binyamin wasn't born yet. Binyamin was not yet born. He was the only one who wasn't yet born. And therefore, Binyamin never bowed down to Esav. And because of that, Mordechai had within him a little bit of part of the DNA of his Zayda Binyamin, right? Who is somehow on a different path and will refuse to bow down, right? So in other words, and within Jewish history, there have always been situations where living under the power of non-Jewish nations, Jewish people have to submit and have to be accept the authority of the non-Jewish world, even if it means humbling themselves and into submission. But there are always some people who are B'nai Binyamin, who are the descendants of Binyamin, who are the what should we say? I was going to say the Meir Kahanas, the Meir Kahanas of this world, and the like, who take a different view completely and say no, the policy towards the enemy is not to be submissive and to appease them. The policy is lekam v'loizah, to show no submission whatsoever. So Mordechai here is refusing to submit. He is, by doing that, he's angering Haman, triggering off the whole potential disaster, which eventually he saved Klal Yisrael from. But the bottom line is he was only rotzui leroiv echov, that some of his colleagues were still angry with him about his initial policy. But let's go back for a minute to the pasuk. I want to show you some interesting things here. So it says here, so the king's servant said to Mordechai, why don't you obey the king's orders? Right? So he says, he doesn't. Right? And he becomes very angry. And here's an interesting pasuk. Vayivez be'enov l'shloach yod b'Mordechai levado. This word vayivez is an interesting, you can say I've highlighted the word vayivez. Does anyone know where word vayivez appears in Sefer Bereshis? Ring any bells with anybody?
Vayivez Esav et HaBechorah.
Vayivez Esav et HaBechorah. Exactly right. The only other time the vayivez appears in this format is Esav, who is the Zayda of Haman. Haman's Zayda, Esav. Vayivez Esav as HaBechorah. In that word vayivez, right? It's the beginning of Parshas told us in the story where Esav sells the birthright to Yaakov for a bowl of soup. Even though the truth is most of the Mefarshim take the view that whole event was only really recorded in the Torah to give us an insight into Esav's mind. You can't really sell a Bechorah. A birthright is something which is intrinsic. You can't, if you're a kohen, you can't sell your kahuna, right? If you're a firstborn, you can't sell your birthright. It's not actually something which can be sold. The point of this whole story was that by Yivez Esav as HaBechorah. The point was to see that Esav really denigrated and was disdainful towards the Bechorah. He felt that it was just something disgusting. And here you are again, 1,000 years later or more, that by Yivez ba'eino b'shloach yod Mordechai levado ki higidelo as am Mordechai, right? That he didn't want to kill. He felt that executing Mordechai wasn't good enough for him. He felt that this was the trigger where he plotted to kill Klal Yisrael. Because of this moment, that's how the Pasuk describes it. Because by Yevakesh Haman lahashmid es kol Yehudim, this is where he decides on his final solution. And here we're coming. Excuse me. And here we're coming to the Pasuk. So when was it that he decided? So B'chodesh Harishon, it was Nisan. B'chodesh Harishon, Chodesh Nisan. Actually, in the whole Tanakh, we don't find the names for the months. Only in Megillas Esther, which was in Persia, we find, and many of the Mefarshim take the view that the words Nisan, Iyar, Sivan, Tammuz are actually, the Ramban al Torah, for example, says these are all Persian and Babylonian words. They come from the Golos. They come from this period in history. In the whole of the Tanakh, it's just referred to as Chodesh Harishon, Chodesh Hasheni. There are no names for the months. But here we find in Megillas Esther, Chodesh Harishon, Chodesh Nisan, right? And we are in the 12th year, in the 12th year of Achashverosh's rule, right? So don't forget the Seudah, the opening chapter of Megillas Esther took place in the 3rd year of his rule, and Esther was taken in the 5th year. So Esther's been with him already for 7 years. Esther's been there for 7 years. She's been married to this Persian emperor, and she's been held captive in the harem of the emperor for 7 years. And during those 7 years, she has no idea why she's there. And Mordechai also has got no idea why Esther, who was a tzaddikus, why she was being subjected to such a fate, that she should be taken in such a way. But we see, Chazal say to this, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, hiktim refuah lamaka. That HaKadosh Baruch Hu, in some sense, has given us before the problem arrives, HaKadosh Baruch Hu has already given us the solution. It's only that we haven't discovered the solution yet. Right? Before the virus came, HaKadosh Baruch Hu put into the world a vaccine. The only question was, would we succeed in discovering the vaccine and discovering the remedy? But the remedy is there, just needs to be uncovered. Now, what's interesting in this pasuk is, what did he do? What did Haman do? And here comes these two words that are the origin of the word Purim. Hipil Pur. Who are Goro, Lifnei Haman, that they cast a lot, the lottery. It's called a Goro. The Hipil Pura, a Goro, Miyom Lechodesh Neimasa, Hu Chodesh Adar. Why is that important to know? Why is that relevant? And why does that become the name of the Yontif? That is really one of the puzzles. There are lots of puzzles, there are about 20 different puzzles of Purim, and this is one puzzle. Why is that become the name of the Yontif? So here comes an interesting issue for which you need to know a few psukim in Sefer Bereshis and how Chazal understood these psukim. But let me just tell you in advance that it seems to be that this Pur wasn't a random lottery. He wasn't just throwing the dice. There was something. This was a type of a lottery system, which was, say Chazal, it was an astrological device. He was using the astrological wisdom of his advisors. In the ancient world, astrology was a very big deal. All leaders and all kings and all generals used astrological devices to decide when was the most opportune moment, when was a moment which was blessed, so to speak, by the stars, by the constellations. There was this idea that somehow in the stars, that everything is written in the stars. That the stars, in fact, astrology represented in the ancient world the concept of predetermination. Everything is predetermined, right? It's written in the stars that this and this will happen. This is, if you like, fate, blind, predetermined fate over which we have no control. And this whole perspective on life really runs through the whole Tanakh period and even in the Gemara. And it was really at the time of the Rishonim. The Rishonim, the Rambam, the Ibn Ezra, the Ramban debate heavily what is our Jewish attitude towards astrology. Is there any truth in it at all? Astrology, incidentally, of course, is completely different to astronomy. Astronomy means mathematics. Astronomy is science. Astronomy is the movement of the planets and understanding what's happening in outer space. But astrology is using the constellations, using the planets to try and decipher what is predestined for mankind. And so most astrologers are just charlatans and just con men. But the idea is that there are some astronomers who really know how this thing works, who really know how to read the signs in the stars. Is it mutter for us? This is generally a good question. Is it permitted for us to read astrological predictions, right? The answer seems to be no. The answer is that we shouldn't. It's part of Tomim Tiyem Hashem Elokecha, the restriction against lo tenachesh, lo teonein, not to engage in any magical, black magical devices. One also shouldn't. You're allowed to read it for entertainment, but you're not allowed to take it seriously. Astrology for us is a joke. We consider it as a joke, but why do we consider it as a joke? Is it just because we think that the astrologers are con men? No, there's something much deeper going on here. And what's deeper is a pasuk in Parshas Lech Lecha, which we're now going to look at. Have a look at this, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, so you'll see in a minute what does this got to do. So it says Vayoma Avram. So in chapter 15 in Bereshis, in Parshas Lech Lecha, Avram complains to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We've looked at this pasuk before in a different context, and he says, "Hein lila nasato zera." Here am I, and you haven't given me any children. V'nei ben beisi yeresh osi, and my manager Eliezer, he will inherit my estate. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu says to him, I promise you, he won't inherit you. You will have children. So here, Avraham Avinu is promised again. He was promised earlier in chapter 13 already, but in chapter 15, he's again promised that he will have children. And here comes the interesting pasuk. We've looked at this pasuk before in connection with, if you remember, we looked at the fact that the Jewish people are compared to the sand, the dust, and the stars. And this is the pasuk which compares them to the stars. But I'm looking at this pasuk again at a different word in this pasuk. It says here, "Vayotze oso hachutza." HaKadosh Baruch Hu took him outside, and he said to him, "Habet na hashamayma." Have a look at the heavens. Usfara kachovim tucha lisparosam. Try and count the stars. Vayomer ko yezarecha. That's how your descendants will be. Okay, a lovely pasuk, giving Avraham Avinu confidence in the future of his family. What does this mean by Yotze Osa Hachutza? It's a strange phrase, this Yotze Osa Hachutza. First of all, it's unnecessary. The pasuk could simply have read, Vayoma habetna hashamayma, go and have a look at the heavens. We don't know where he was, in the tent, in the outside, wherever he was. If HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, have a look at the heavens, he has to go outside and look at the heavens, look at the stars. Right? Why does and also if it just means that he was inside and he had to go outside, it could have said Vayelech hachutza. That he went out and looked at the stars. What does it mean Vayotze osa hachutza? That HaKadosh Baruch Hu took him outside. So Chazal understand this phrase is a crucial phrase, not only in the life of Abraham, but in the destiny of Klal Yisrael, and relates directly to Megillas Esther, and indeed in the Vilna Gaon's commentary on the pasuk Hipil Pur Hu HaGorol, on this pasuk in chapter 3 about the Pur. On that pasuk, the Vilna Gaon's got a whole piece about this pasuk, that Vayotze Osa Achutza changed something radically in the destiny of Klal Yisrael. That Klal Yisrael had a destiny rather than a fate. It wasn't a blind, predetermined fate, but there was a destiny to Klal Yisrael. Vayotze osa achutza, says Rashi. So I'll first show you the Rashi, and then we'll look at the Gemara on which Rashi is based. Right? The pshat is, he went out of his tent. What is the chutza? What does it mean, go outside? So Rashi says, okay, the pshat is he went out of his tent to look at the stars. Ulafi midrasho, but there is also a very beautiful medrash chazal. The medrash is, Omalo, tseimi itstagninus shoch. Itstagninus is the word Chazal used for astrology. Right? I don't think it's a Hebrew word, actually. I think it's a Roman or Greek word. I have a feeling it's a Greek word, itstagninus. It's a Greek word referring to astrologers who want to predict the future based on their reading of the stars. So he says he took him outside. So Chazal say mi itstagninus shocha. He didn't mean go out of your tent. He means go out of your way of thinking. What way of thinking did he have? Says Rashi, Shero iso b'mazolos. You were reading the stars. And in the stars you saw Sha'eincha osid lahamid ben, that you're not going to have a son. In other words, you saw in the mazolos that you're not going to have a son. Right? But I'm telling you that you will. So what's happening here? Something very fascinating is happening here. Rashi is saying, this was a crucial moment in the life of Avraham Avinu, where he was told that he and his son and his descendants are not included in the whole system which is controlled by the mazolos. The mazolos, I think I mentioned you once or twice before in this shir, the whole issue of mazel, we're going to have a look in a moment in the Gemara, the whole issue of mazel is a concept which Klal Yisrael have a very ambivalent relationship to. Even though, as I think I've mentioned before, unfortunately, we have the custom of saying Mazel Tov, right? But in actual fact, Mazel Tov should not be a really Jewish greeting. I personally don't like the greeting Mazel Tov, even though I use it just to be sociable, you understand. But in actual fact, Mazel Tov is the wrong greeting to give somebody, because we don't really relate to the mazel. The mazel is the predestined, if you like, a destiny of somebody. In actual fact, we live under the hashgacha of HaKadosh Baruch Hu is the opposite of mazel. Mazel means that it's all fixed and predestined. Hashgacha means that we have a personal relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and we are protected in a way which is hachutza. So Chazal, Rashi says the word vayotze osa hachutza doesn't mean he took him out of his tent. It means he took him out of the system. There's a system of the mazalos. The implication here is that they do indeed have an effect on mankind. There is something about the control of the stars that their constellations do affect mankind, but Vayotze Osa Achutza, Klal Yisrael are outside of that system. They're not included in that system. And this is really, says the Vilna Gaon, Hipil Purhu Agorol, that Haman wanted to use astrology to find out when was the weakest day of all the days of the year, when were the Jewish people least protected, and he discovered it was the 13th of Adar, right? But, says the Vilna Gaon, he didn't realize that actually Klal Yisrael were not part of this system at all. And therefore, if they had the zechus, if they davened to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and Mordechai and Esther had the merit to lead them properly, then the astrological prediction wouldn't affect them at all. And this is also one of the simchas of Purim. Purim became a type of a test case, right? That Klal Yisrael were not subject to any predestination or any mazolos at all. So I want to show you the origin of this Rashi. So there's a Gemara in Shabbos. Gemara in Shabbos Kuf Nun Vav. Can you see this is a reference here? It's a Gemara, for those of you who are able to look it up, it's a Gemara worth looking up. Rabbi Yochanan Amar. So Rabbi Yochanan says, Ein mazel li Yisrael. Ein mazel Yisrael. So when you read that at first, it sounds like, oh, he's got no muzzle. And colloquially, you say about someone who's got no muzzle, you say he's an unlucky person, bad things happen to him. This Gemara means exactly the opposite. Ein mazel Yisrael. Rabbi Yochanan, I'll have a look at the English translation. Rabbi Yochanan said, there is no constellation predetermination for the Jewish people that influences them, right? The Jewish people are not subject to the influence of astrology. This is the statement of Rabbi Yochanan, right? And he brings a pasuk from Yirmiyahu, but what I'm interested in is the second pasuk. Af Rav. So Rav came along and said, you know what, you're absolutely right. Ein mazel Yisrael. The mazolos, the predestined, what's written in the stars doesn't affect Klal Yisrael. The Amirah of Yahudah Rav. So one of the famous Talmidim of Rav was the Amirah of Yahudah. He said, Minayin she'ein mazel Yisrael. Where did my Rebbe, where did Rav get this idea from? Ein mazel Yisrael. Shenema, the pasuk says, Vayotze oso hachutza. That's the pasuk. That's the Gemara in Kuf Nun Vav that Rashi is basing himself on, right? Omar Avram Lifnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Avram said to the Almighty, Rebbeinu Shel Olam ben Beisi Yeresh Osi. I'm going to be inherited by somebody who's not my nature, not my family. To which HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, no, you will see. Ki b'yetzi v'me'echa. Right? So this is Omar Avram says to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Rebbeinu Shel Olam, nistakalti b'tztagninus sheli. I've looked at the constellations. Ve'eni roi laholid ben, and I am never going to have children. I'm never going to have children. Right? To which HaKadosh Baruch Hu says to him, Tzei mi'itztagninus shelcha. You have to go out. You are outside of this system. She'ein mazel Yisrael. Klal Yisrael are not affected by these systems. So here you have, and this became a cornerstone of Jewish philosophy and the hashkafa of Klal Yisrael. That actually, so it's a bit more complicated than we think. It's not true to say that there is no truth at all to astrology. It's not true to say that there is no, if you like, predetermined events which have been written, so to speak, in the stars. That's not. There is predetermination. It's just that Klal Yisrael have a different path. Klal Yisrael are not included in it because from the very beginning, Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov were outside of that system. And that's what I meant when I said to you at the beginning of the Shia. The events of Sefer Bereshis are the yesod of the whole of the Tanakh and the whole of Jewish history. If we understand properly what HaKadosh Baruch Hu said to Avraham Avinu, Vayotze oso hachutza, it affects our hashkafa on everything that happens in the whole Tanakh and the whole of our lives, the lives of Klal Yisrael. These are not simply random events of mazel, right? Ein mazel Yisrael. The mazel is not the crucial factor, right? The mazel is a factor in the world, but Klal Yisrael, this is also incidentally, the Arachai HaKadosh says, it's a strange thing. If Avraham Avinu is told he's going to be the father of a great nation, why is it, in fact, that both Sarah and Rivka seem to have had great difficulty having children? You would have thought the obvious blessing that Avraham and Yitzchak would get would be that they would be married to women who are able to give birth and then they'll have children. So Arachaim says no. Sorry, I forgot to turn off my sound. Sorry, my apologies. I usually remember, but occasionally other things are happening. So Arachaim HaKadosh says it was important that both Yitzchak and Yaakov were born shaloi kederech hateva. In other words, their birth was not part of the natural forces of this world. They weren't born out of, because had they been born within the teva, within nature, then their destiny would also be part of the natural forces. And the natural forces of this world do have a certain element of predetermination, predetermined. Right? In the modern world, just by the way, as a footnote here, there's a whole separate share really, but the modern world also speaks about, doesn't speak so much about astrology. Astrology isn't taken so seriously by many people in the West nowadays, but it is, the idea is, if you like, that psychologists and geneticists will say, whatever you do in life has been predetermined by your biology, by your genetics, by your early childhood experiences, by your brain chemistry. It's all been predetermined. You think you've got free choice to do what you like, but free choice is a illusion. That is the view of most of secular psychologists, geneticists, and biochemists who say, look, it's all, we only think we've got freedom of choice because we don't know completely all the forces that are going on in our brain. But if we knew it all, we would be able to, it's all cause and effect. We can't choose anything at all. And the answer is no, Klal Yisrael have got the power of a Bechira to go above and beyond natural forces. And that's really the Simcha of Purim. Simcha of Purim, so let's go back to the original question. Why is it called Purim? It's called Purim because Haman wanted to use the Pur, the astrological devices, to determine the destruction of the Jewish people, right? And he discovered that the destruction of the Jewish people is not written into the astrological devices at all, because Klal Yisrael have a different destiny. The Hashgacha of HaKadosh Baruch Hu became very evident, right? The Hashgacha of HaKadosh Baruch Hu became very clear from the fact that this Pur, that this lottery simply wasn't functional. So this relates a little bit, just to remind you what we did last week when we spoke about Korcho Baderech. Korcho Baderech means everything is a mikra, right? Everything is by chance. But if you understood the idea of Purim properly, then you'll understand that the whole point of the word Purim and the story of Purim is to show that this was Hashgacha b'Hakadosh Baruch Hu, that they suddenly realized that there was the divine plan was really the dominant plan. So we looked at all this last week. We looked at this last week. If you remember, last week we also spoke about the Korban Omer. Don't know if you remember that, ladies and gentlemen. Last week we spoke about the fact, the Chazal that says that actually Haman was killed on the day of the Omer, the Korban Omer, on the 16th of Nisan, and I showed you some of this. Bear with me for 1 second. Right. So I'd like to have a look now. I'd like to just go back a little bit now and address one of the questions I mentioned before, and that was what was really Mordechai's thinking when he angered Haman? Why was he so confident? This is one of the interesting things that come out in Megillas Esther, that Mordechai is absolutely confident that he's going to succeed in destroying Haman, and that he winds him up. He winds him up and he angers him and he defies him again and again and again in order that Haman should really reach some sort of a decision to destroy the Jewish people, and then he gets rid of him. But it's a gamble. It's a gamble. What was going through his mind? What was going through the mind of Mordechai at that time? So here's a very interesting thing, which is really a subject for a bit of a longer discussion, but I'll just try and give it to you. I've got 10 minutes of the shir left. Let me explain what's going on here. Mordechai understood something about the, if you like, the point in history where the Jewish people were holding. So I don't know if I mentioned it before in this shir, I've mentioned it in other shirim, that actually in order to understand Megillas Esther properly, you have to learn the first 4 chapters of the book of Ezra. Have I mentioned this here in this shir? I don't know if I mentioned this. The book of Ezra, everybody's got homework, ladies and gentlemen. You're getting homework. Find yourself an English translation of the Tanakh and look up the book of Ezra. My guess is you've never read it before. And read the first 4 chapters of the book of Ezra. Read the first 4 chapters. And you'll find something absolutely extraordinary. You'll find that it was the Persian emperor who was the predecessor of Achashverosh, right? Emperor called Cyrus, right? So Cyrus gave permission to the Jewish people to leave Persia and to go back to Eretz Yisrael and rebuild the Bayis Sheni, to build the second temple in Israel, right? They had been exiled by the previous empire, which was the Babylonian Empire of Nebuchadnezzar, but the Persians had conquered the Babylonians. So now we've moved from Golus Bovel to Golus Porus of Modai. And now we're in the second Golus of the Persians. There are 4 Goluyas for Chazal. There is first Bovel, and then there's Porus of Modai, and then there's Golus Yovon, which is the Hanukkah story, and then there's Golus Edom, which is the Romans who destroyed the second temple. These are the 4 different historical era within the literature of Chazal. So we're in the second era of Porus of Modai. The first king is Cyrus, and then he's followed by Achashverosh. Cyrus gives permission, so Zerubbabel takes 42,360 people, and they go on Aliyah, and they, with song and with music and with money and with protection, they arrive in Israel, and they lay the foundations for the Bayis Sheni. What happens next? Does anybody know what happens next? Any offers from anybody? What's the next thing that happens? Anybody got any offers? Dina wants to say.
The Samaritans get in their way.
What did you want to say, Dina?
That the Shobranim, as I think Shirley just said, give a bad report back to Koresh that the Jews want to not pay taxes, and then they won't pay taxes, kind of like a rebellion.
Right.
Not paying taxes.
The Pasuk speaks about the Shobranim, but it speaks about others as well. There were a whole group of of the enemies of Klal Yisrael who wanted to ban. You could, if you like.
It was heard, but she gave it
the United Nations, if you like. They wanted only to depict Israel in a negative light.
Dina.
They wanted to depict Israel in a negative light and told Koresh, don't let them build the Beis HaMikdash. Now, what's interesting is, I want to tell you, if you learn Rashi on Megillas Esther, nobody ever really gets around to learning Rashi on Megillas Esther, but if you would learn Rashi on Megillas Esther, you will find that Rashi asks the question, why are we so interested in the 10 sons of Haman? We've never heard of them before. We never hear of them again. Why are they mentioned again and again? So Rashi says the 10 sons of Haman were the people who slandered the Jewish people and stopped them building the Bayis Sheni. That it was the 10 sons of Haman who were responsible for Achashverosh revoking the permission, the royal permission to build Bayis Sheni was revoked. Why was it revoked? Because of this slanderous Kosvu Sitna, the Pasuk says in Ezra chapter 4. They wrote Sitna. Sitna means hatred. They wrote letters of hatred which were all completely fabricated, unjustified at all. But nevertheless, it did the trick. And so it was the 10 sons of Haman who advised Achashverosh to withdraw permission to build the Bayis Sheni. And then the Bayis Sheni building stops, and you've got 42,000 odd people in Israel who've been left high and dry. There they are, sitting there. They can't proceed with establishing themselves in the country. They no longer have protection from the Persian government, and they're in limbo, right? And this lasts for 18 years. For 18 years, This situation lasts. And then suddenly chapter 5 says that Zechariah and Haggai and Zechariah gave a nevuah. Now it's time. Now we can start building. And then the rest of Sefer Ezra is about how they built the Beis Hamikdash, and everybody came back on Aliyah, whatever it is. What happened during those 18 years between the end of chapter 4 and the beginning of chapter 5 of Sefer Ezra? What happened? The answer is Megillas Esther. Megillas Esther is the missing piece of the jigsaw of the narrative of the book of Ezra. There's like a black hole in the middle of the book of Ezra, which is very surprising. We don't know, how did they solve the problem? How did they solve the problem of Ahasuerus forbidding them to build the Beis Hamikdash? How did they solve it? The answer is Megillas Esther. Right? And indeed, Megillas Esther enabled them, because of the story of Esther, they were then able, and what's interesting is that Ahasuerus, his whole life, refuses to give permission to build the Beis Hamikdash, but he dies or gets killed, and he is, his successor is Darius II, actually. His successor is Darius, and according to Rashi and the Radak and the Ibn Ezra and the Medrash Rabbah, who was Darius? Does anybody know who was Darius according to Rashi?
Esther's son.
Esther's son.
Son.
Darius was the son of Esther Hamelech. So you had a Jewish boy sitting on the Persian throne. Darius then gives permission to rebuild the Bais Sheni, and chapter 5 of Ezra can go ahead, and the whole of Shivas Tzion and the Bais Sheni works. Now here's an interesting thing. So the pasuk says, I asked you a question. What was it that Mordechai knew which enabled him to anger Haman in the way that he did it? What was it that he knew? He must have known something, right? Because he didn't have any nevuah, right? Mordechai wasn't a navi. At no point in the Megillah does it say, Vaydaber Hashem el Mordechai. He didn't have any nevuah, but he had a chachma. Mordechai was one of the Anshe Knesses HaGedolah, was one of the Gedolei Yisrael of that period. So he had a nevuah. It wasn't the type of a nevuah, the type of what you might call a Ruach HaKodesh. What did he know in his wisdom? So what he knew was, I want to show you now a Rambam, and with that we'll finish the shir. Let's have a look at this Rambam. This is a very interesting Rambam based on a Gemara in Sanhedrin. So the Gemara here in Hilchos Malachim says as follows: Shalosh mitzvos nitztavu Yisrael b'shas knisason la'aretz. There are 3 mitzvahs that the Jewish people are commanded to do when they enter the land of Israel. What the Rambam here wants to say is, out of the Tariag mitzvahs, there are some mitzvahs which are incumbent on Kohanim, some on Leviim, some on the Sanhedrin, but there are 3 mitzvahs which in a sense are obligatory. There is no individual who is obliged to do this. It's a mitzvah for Klal Yisrael. It's a mitzvah for the Jewish people as a nation, these 3 mitzvot, right? What are they? The first one is L'manos lahem melech. They have to appoint a king. They have to appoint a leader, a king. The second thing is Ulahachris Zaro Shel Amalek. They have to destroy Amalek. And then V'livnos Beis HaBechira. And then they can build the Beis Hamikdash. Okay, so you've got these 3 mitzvahs. The Rambam goes on to say, and they have to happen in that order. You first need a king, and then you need to destroy Amalek, and then you build a Beis Hamikdash. So what's interesting here is, I'll just say this very quickly, that Rav Tzadok HaKohen and other of the Mefarshim here say very beautifully, he says, what did Mordechai know? Mordechai knew that they were on the threshold of building the Bais Sheni. This was, again, another layer of the great simcha of Purim, was that because of the story of Purim, the Jewish people got the green light to build the Bais Sheni. They've been living with a red light for 18 years. Now they got the green light to build Bais Sheni. Right? But Mordechai knew something. Mordechai knew that before you can build the Beis HaMikdash, there has to be Mechias Amalek, that the destruction of Amalek was a prerequisite. Why is it a prerequisite? That's a separate share completely. But there is before you can build a Beis HaMikdash, which is to bring Kedusha down into this world, right? It's the Amalek, which is the antithesis, the nemesis of Kedusha, has to be weakened, has to be destroyed. So Mordechai knew that Haman was Amalek, and he knew that they were about to build the Beis HaMikdash. And he realized that the whole Purim story was an exercise in Mechias Amalek. And that's why this Shabbos and every Shabbos before Purim, we read Parsha Zachar, because Parsha Zachar is really, on a deeper level, defines the meaning of Megillas Esther. Megillas Esther was the destruction of Amalek 2,400 years ago, which enabled them then to proceed to build the Bayis Sheni. It was like it was a mafteach. The reason, spiritually speaking, politically speaking, they couldn't build the Beis HaMikdash because Achashverosh had withdrawn royal permission. Spiritually speaking, they couldn't build the Beis HaMikdash because they hadn't yet engaged in Mechias Amalek. The destruction of Amalek has to proceed. In the same way, incidentally, in the Parshas HaShavua that we're reading at the moment, right? Before they could build the Mishkan in Parshas Truma Tetzaveh Kisisa, they're building the Mishkan. They had to have a battle against Amalek in Parshas Beshalach. The battle against Amalek to destroy Amalek in Parshas Beshalach was a preamble to the building of the Mishkan. Similarly, Shaul HaMelech is destroying Amalek as a preamble to the Bayis Rishon, and Mordechai is destroying Amalek as a preamble to the Bayis Sheni. Before you can build the Beis HaMikdash, says the Rambam, there has to be a type of activity, ki yod al keisiyah, milchama al Hashem ba'amalek midar dar. This is a necessary precondition. And that's what Mordechai knew. Just one last thing, somebody just texted me, what about the requirement for a king? So there's an interesting thing here. Again, another detail in Megillas Esther, which needs a bit more understanding. There's a big emphasis that both Mordechai and Esther had a type of a status of Malchus, right? It says about Esther, about Tilbash, Esther, Malchus, Hamalka Esther. So they didn't have, if you like, Jewish sovereignty, but they had a Jewish queen who was Hamalka Esther. She's not just Esther, she's Esther Hamalka, because that was the Malchus, and not only was Esther, but if you look at the very end of the Megillah, it speaks about Mordechai being dressed bilavush Malchus, Tacheles V'chur, right? Mordechai also walks around dressed in the royal garb. Why do we need to know that? It's just nice to be dressed in royal garb? The answer is no. The Malchus, in other words, the royalty of Esther and Mordechai, was one of the prerequisites. Destroying Haman was prerequisite number 2, and now there's a green light for Binyan Beis HaMikdash, for building the Bayis Sheni. That's Ezra chapter 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. This is the next stage of Jewish history, was if you like, paralyzed. Klal Yisrael were paralyzed at this stage for 18 years until they suddenly got the green light to go ahead and build the Bayis Sheni. So what I want to say to you is just a final thing. There are lots of levels of the Simcha of Purim. One level of the Simcha of Purim is there was a genocidal threat which was taken away from them. That's already a relief. They weren't in fear anymore. The second level of Simcha was they suddenly saw that they weren't under the astrological signs. They were vayotzeus achutza. They were living under the hashgacha of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. They were not subject to any astrological predictions. That's a level of Simcha as well. And the next level of Simcha was they could now forge ahead, go back to Eretz Yisrael, Shivat Zion, and rebuild the Bayis Sheni. And this was a tremendous Simcha for them as the next stage in Jewish history. And all this is really Megillas Esther. Megillas Esther, right, is the mafteach, is the moment where suddenly Jewish history can proceed in its positive way. Klal Yisrael can return to Eretz Yisrael, Beis Hamikdash, and that's the Simcha of Purim. That's it, ladies and gentlemen. Please God.